Hello, my name is Alan Wakim, and I am with the Sons of History. Today we have the honor and privilege of interviewing Colonel Charles McGee. He was with the Tuskegee Airmen, yes, the famous Tuskegee Airmen from World War II. We were very fortunate to run into him today, so we're going to ask him a few questions, and I think you will find this a great treat. So, here is Colonel Charles McGee. How are you doing today, Colonel?
I'm doing fine, and I hope you are too.
I'm doing well. How do you like Houston so far?
Houston's great. Unfortunately, the weather isn't the best, and hope the sun comes out while I'm here. But the crowd and the activity is super.
Excellent. Now, where do you live right now?
I live in Bethesda, Maryland now. Many years since I was in Kansas City, Missouri.
Wow, that's a long way, Bethesda. I used to work there.
I say yes, it is, but it's good to be able to be here and share with the folks that are gathered for this year's Wings Over Houston.
Well, excellent. Well, I have a couple of questions for you, which I'm hoping that if people had the opportunity to ask you a question, that these would be the questions they would ask. So, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, here we go. First,
Yes.
Because Hollywood likes to overdo movies or maybe even books, some of the books that come out. Do you have a recommendation for any movies that people can see that's realistic or that you enjoyed?
Well, certainly the Red Tails movie by George Lucas, that's the most recent, is, as war movies go, I think quite good. But certainly they do take license to attract people to come into the theater. So everything in it, you say, well, it's a composite. That wasn't me, but it's that type of thing. There was a movie, PBS, in the early 90s that is a documentary, so if you can compare the two, you really get the picture. But also George Lucas did a documentary called Double Victory. Victory over Hitler in Europe and victory over racism here at home. And if you can find that, and I've been told that if you buy disc, if you get the Blu-ray version of Red Tails, he also has the version of Double Victory there. So then you get the real picture and you get the movie picture where they take a little license.
Okay, well, now I know there was also a Tuskegee Airman movie that had Lawrence Fishburne and Cuba Gooding Jr. What did you think of that one?
Well, they did a good job of the acting. I'd just say that because they take a little license, you can say, well, that's a composite. That wasn't me, maybe, or partially it was. So it's one of those things you have to take what you get.
Okay, all right. Well, now, what moment or event while you were with the Tuskegee Airmen stood out? What do you remember the most? Maybe it might have been anyone famous you met or events during the fighting itself.
Well, certainly, standing out was our leadership under the leadership that we had from Ben Davis Jr. And if folks don't know his history, he graduated from West Point in 1936, but went 4 years of silent treatment, only spoken to on official business, had no roommate. It was quite, but he went as a captain, went through the training that the Army initially thought was an experiment, 99th Pursuit Squadron, and became the squadron commander, but later they realized that his classmates from West Point were all lieutenant colonels, so they bumped him up. But he started out as our leadership as lieutenant colonel and eventually full colonel. But it's like having the right person at the right time for the right job. We couldn't have had better leadership, and he certainly focused and let us young, as I say, rash second and first lieutenants know what the task was, what the assignment was, and what his expectations were, and that was great for us.
Okay. What did you fly?
I flew with all of the now called Tuskegee Airmen. We weren't called Tuskegee Airmen earlier. That was the location of our training. But as pilot graduates, we all were checked out in the P-40. But only the first squadron, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, flew it in combat. The 3 fighter squadrons that followed them were combat ready in the P-40, and then they said, well, we're changing it to the P-39 Bel Air Cobra. So the 99th went into combat flying the P-40, doing interdiction and ground support, North Africa, Sicily, and into Italy. The other 3 squadrons, the 332nd Fighter Group, went directly into Italy, and we were doing, with the P-39 Bel Air Cobra, patrol of Naples Harbor and the waterways to the Anzio beachhead and that type of thing. But in the spring of 44, the 332nd Fighter Group was one of the 4 groups picked to begin escorting our bombers. You know, they thought we had enough guns on our B-17s and B-24s to protect them from the German Air Force, and that turned out not to be the case. But for each bomber lost, that's 10 American lives. So 4 groups were picked from 12th Tactical Air Force to move to 15th Strategic Air Force, and we picked up P-47 Thunderbolts in combat and began the escort work. But 3 months later, we got the P-51 Mustang, which turned out, particularly the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, was super for the job we had. Range, speed, and altitude capability was exceptional and perfect, particularly for escorting B-17s that flew a little bit higher than the B-24s, but the perfect aircraft for the task that we were assigned.
And did you have a red tail on your plane?
Yes. You know, that's interesting. Everybody, a lot of folks aren't realize how did we become a red tail. 15th Air Force realized that these planes suddenly showing up for escort were not German. And the gunners on our bombers needed to recognize one squadron had yellow tail, one had candy stripe, red and white, another had checkerboard, orange and black. 332nd Fighter Group had the red tail. That stuck with us, so that's why now they say those of us that got into combat of the Tuskegee Airmen were the red tails. Of course, that's not all of the Tuskegee Airmen story, but it is the story of those who got overseas.
Okay, now what, I know everyone, as you were saying that y'all were not known as Tuskegee Airmen at the time, so if you could tell the audience, what was the name of the fighter group or the squadron, that way when they look it up, they'll know exactly what the name of it was.
Okay. The experiment that the Army Air Corps started with was the 99th Pursuit Squadron, later changed to 99th Fighter Squadron, flying P-40 aircraft. Following them was the 332nd Fighter Group, 3 additional single-engine fighter squadrons, the 100th, the 301st, and 302nd, that became the 332nd Fighter Group. And although we had become combat ready in the P-40, we were switched to the P-39 and went into combat first with the P-39. Then the group being one of the 4 picked to begin the escort work, we switched to the P-47 Thunderbolt in combat, continued about 3 months later with the P-51 Mustang, which was from July of 44 on through the end of the war. It was the P-51, and of course that was the key aircraft that had the range, speed, and altitude capability that allowed us to do a tremendous job.
Okay, now I'm sure everyone wants to know, I know y'all did a lot of escorts. So did you manage to shoot down any plane? Did you damage any plane? And what was I know y'all had the Messerschmitts. Did you ever come across the 262, 109?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I ended up with the victory in August of 44, catching a Focke-Wulf 190. But in our 172 escort missions, fortunately we had no losses, and I think we destroyed in the air well over 100 German aircraft, but we also had fighter sweeps once we destroyed their oil-making potential and that type of thing. We destroyed probably more aircraft on fighter sweeps on the ground than we did in the air.
That's...
For those who want to know the story, and certainly to correct something that has often been said, things get said and it sounds good. Because somebody had told Colonel Davis that we never lost a bomber under escort. Well, I'd just say if you ever use the word never, you have to qualify. We never lost a bomber escorting on 172 missions. We had 179 missions. So there were some losses, but research has shown that the 332nd Fighter Group's record was the best of the groups doing escort work for 15th Air Force, both in aircraft in commission, number of losses, and that type of thing.
I had heard that there were some bombers that were lost to flak, but it was losing them to German fighter. That was where the record really stood out.
That was the toughest thing for them. The number, of course, a bomber with one engine, some with two engines out could get back home with damage by flak, but a number were lost. But it was with the escort that allowed, and then of course what it was all about was saving lives, because each bomber that was able to get back safely meant lives saved. A bomber lost, most of the bombers, that would be 10 American lives. So that's what the escort work was all about. The focus was on saving lives, and as I say, the leadership that we had under Ben Davis Jr. let us race second and first lieutenants know what the task was. So we didn't do any happy hunting. If our bomber group was attacked, we dispatched elements to chase them off. But we didn't leave the bombers just because there was word that there were German aircraft in the air. And that made a difference in the record that we were able to accomplish. Although I had come home when I was still there through November of '44, we saw Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, but those that were there into '45, just before the war ended, on a long flight to Berlin, actually ran into the jet Me-262, and they were able to destroy it. In fact, the group destroyed 3 on their mission, which was unusual, but accomplished again with the P-51.
Wow. The 262.
Me-262 jet that were put up in the defense of Berlin just before the war ended. So I never saw one of the jets in the air on the missions that I was there, but as I say, that was late in the war when Germany had developed the jet and put it in the part of their defense structure.
For those of you who do not know, the primary weapon that the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force, used was, I know there was the Messerschmitt 109 and the Bf 109, but at the end of the war, and those were propeller planes. At the end of the war, the Germans whipped out these fighter jets. I mean, these were not propellers; these were jet fighters. They were known as the Messerschmitt 262. That is the jet fighter that he is referring to.
Yes, that's right. Which was put in the air very late in the war. And I had come home, so I never saw one.
You never saw one. Now, how did your family and friends react when you came home, knowing that you served the way you did?
Well, many didn't know how well we had served, and it's a bit unfortunate at that time that although the Air Force later integrated, we were segregated in all of our training and in all of our combat work And many of the bombers did not know that the Red Tails were black pilots. And coming home, we still face the problem of blacks this way, whites this way, and travel accommodations and those things were still a struggle. It took a while. And it's interesting that the Army never changed their policy throughout the war. Of course, the war ending 45 and 47, our United States Air Force was born, if you will, the air arm separating from the ground arm. And in their studies, they had determined that they needed to use people based on training and experience and where needed, not their happenstance of birth, if you will. And they were not getting enough money to keep, at that time, Lockburn Air Base open and meet their requirements, but in a segregated manner. So they needed to integrate. Fortunately, their decision was backed by a very courageous President, Harry Truman, who a few months later issued executive orders in 9981 mandating all the services need to integrate. And I believe 9980 mandated there should be equal access and equal hiring throughout the federal government. But it's very evident that the Air Force and what was taking place was supported by the performance that we rendered that dispelled the biases and generalizations that had become a part of Army war policy, if you will, or mobilization policy. So the Air Force led the country when they closed the segregated base in the 1st of July 1949. Mm-hmm. Big change.
Yeah. So now, were you still in at that time when they integrated, or?
I still was integrated and went to my first integrated assignment to Smoky Hill Air Base, Salina, Kansas. But because of the nature of the country, I never got my family there. I got along fine on my work on base, but still many places off base where blacks were not that welcome, or the opportunities to get housing or that type of thing still was a problem. So it took a few years, and I can understand the civil rights action in the 60s that helped still bring a further change here in the country, and those were just something that we faced, even though the service was providing and, if you will, leading the country in some of this change. It took a while before the same changes that became available across the country.
When would you say things got better for you?
Oh, wow. I didn't put that into months or time. I just know for many times we got better assignments overseas than back here at home because of location. And in those early years, a lot of that was before military bases had housing, so and particularly in the South, that was a big problem for the many assigned there. There was also the school problem, more evident in the South than other places that were quite a bit of problem for growing families. Mm-hmm. But again, change came about slowly. Like we say, segregation is a statement of policy and so on. Integration is the action. That took a little time. So, but eventually, even across the country and in the South, the change came that allowed you to be able to travel, to get a motel or eat at a restaurant without a problem. Took a little while, but again, it was a change that the country needed. Mm-hmm. And although we didn't set out to be a civil rights action, what we accomplished certainly helped lead and help change minds, and as I say, dispel the biases, generalizations, and sometimes racist thoughts that many had against the black American.
I would like to know that's very I don't know. I'm at a loss for words right now. People such as yourself deserve much better, and that's one of my greatest regrets, is that heroes such as yourself were treated in such an ill manner.
Well, I don't consider myself a hero. You know, the country came out of 10 years of depression when the government decided to help our allies in Europe and declared war. And although the action didn't change segregation, the opportunity for people, the jobs, the war buildup, those that wanted to either were drafted or enlisted in the service, all Americans were interested in that change. Blacks as well as whites, but it just took a little time for a lot of folks to realize that. But it's been good for the country, and where we still have problems of, I think we're more diverse now than we were then, and there's still problems. It's something that we have to overcome and realize that it's not color of skin or happenstance of birth that is important. It's the education you get, the opportunities are there, and how you prepare to meet those opportunities.
Okay. When did your unit get the recognition that it deserved? And by the way, I do want to state that you are a hero. You may not call yourself one, but if you look at what the definition of a hero is, or if you look at how people view your unit or view the greatest generation, to all of us, you are heroes. But when would you say that when you finally received the recognition that you and your unit deserved?
Well, I would really say it began when the Air Force ended and closed the segregation base, which was Lockburn Air Base south of Columbus, Ohio at the time, because when training ended in '46, those of us that were still at Tuskegee were assigned to Lockburn Air Base. With that base closed, it was certainly a big step for the country, but that's when things began to change for those of us that and I've often told folks I don't have any good word I can say about segregation, but then on the other hand, I say I do have a good word to say, because in the years, we were together, if you say from 1941 to 1949, we developed lifelong friendships out of that. And that's something we can never turn our back on. But the move and the challenge, the value lessons that sustained us through those days are still good for the young folks today, for our country's future. So that's what has helped, I think, all of us realizing that we have to mentor and motivate our youth to continue the freedoms that we so much enjoy here in America.
Do you still talk to your friends? Are they still? I mean, what?
Oh yes, we didn't organize until 1972, and that's when the name Tuskegee Airmen really was, if you will, cemented in our thoughts and minds by forming a national organization. And we organized in 3 regions across the country, and from probably 4 locations that had strong gatherings: Chicago, Detroit, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles. We ended up, as I say, forming in 3 regions, and we have just over 50 chapters across the country today. We have a very strong, what I want to say, the little words getting away from me, but to motivate youth in aviation and space career. In fact, our two reasons for enrolling the Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated was to preserve the history for what it's meant to the country and motivate youth in aviation space career opportunities. And our National Scholarship Fund is at a level that for the last more than 10 years now, that we annually give some $1,500 scholarships to youth, high school youth that are recommended by the chapters in going to college and any aviation space career opportunity. So it's something that out of our experience we still enjoy our comradeship, but the key is motivating our youth because they are America's future.
Let me ask you this. You get shot down over Central Europe, you have difficulty hiding. You're going to stand out. So what, were you scared? Did adrenaline prevent you being too...
That's certainly a good question, but it turns out that we had some 32 pilots who became German prisoners of war. But in the war, the Germans followed the Geneva Convention. They did not segregate the black pilots that were incarcerated. And that was very interesting because our service overseas was segregated because our Army policy. But the Germans didn't follow that for those who became prisoners of war. So it's interesting to some say that they were better treated for the short time that they were incarcerated than they were faced while they were actually fighting.
It's the irony.
Yes, indeed.
When you look back on your time serving, now do you look back with fondness? Do you smile about it, or is it more of a dark moment in your life that you wish to forget?
I don't have a dark moment in mind. I grew up just with the idea that you always treat others like you want to be treated. I was glad to be a scout, and I still say if everybody lived by the Scout Oath and the 12 Scout Laws, we'd certainly have a different country. But it's attitude, and certainly going around and the chip on your shoulder. Well, I always remember the early saying, "Sticks and stones will break my bones, but words won't hurt me any." So you didn't get in a fight over being called something or because you were denied things. You marched on, if you will, to look for that better day, and fortunately it has come slowly. Some areas it may still exist, but by and large, there are opportunities, and I say the value lessons that sustained us are good for us to pass on to our young people today.
You have any regrets?
I don't have any regrets at all. Sometimes folks ask, why would you serve a country that treated you that way? And I said, well, I know of no other citizenship than being an American. And so what I would pass on for all, in fact, I wish we had universal suffrage and everybody served a couple of years and then went about their business that didn't want to stay in the service. But again, I think we have to look and see what is your attitude, and certainly it should be one to preserve the freedoms that we so much enjoy and assure that our youth are on the right track, that they don't disappear.
You wrote a book. What, if you want to tell the audience, what's the name of the book and how can they get a hold of it?
Well, I do. My oldest daughter really did the writing. Folks used to say, "You need to tell your story." I said, "But I'm not a writer. I'm not a writer." She attended one of our conventions and decided to do it. And then the family shared. She and her brother and sister and I, after she had put a lot of words together, got together and ended up putting out, and the book is called Tuskegee Airman, Biography of Colonel Charles McGee, fighter combat record holder. And that turned out because during my service, having served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, I ended up with a fighter combat record of 100 or more missions in each of those 3 wars. So that was something to pass on, something certainly to be proud of, and it's one of the things that you can just say no regrets.
Colonel Charles McGee, do you have anything else that you would like to add?
Well, the only thing I'd say, the one thing I pass on, I have 4 P's that I pass on to the young folks, and they're good for the adults who are mentoring our young people. Perceive, prepare, perform, persevere. Perceive, dream your dreams, but find your talents, what they are, develop them, and I always like to add, hopefully you find something you like to do, because I loved aviation. But prepare, get a good education, learn to read, write, and speak well, and develop the talents that you've discovered. Perform, always doing your best, but let excellence be your goal in everything that you do, and certainly persevere. You know, we could have hung our heads and gone off in the corner and moped and not done anything, saying they don't like me, don't want me. Don't let the circumstances be your excuse for not achieving.
I'm overwhelmed. This is Colonel Charles McGee, and his son Ronald is filming us. I want to just say that it has been an honor and a pleasure meeting you.
Well, thank you, and my pleasure to be able to share with you indeed.
Well, God bless you. Thank you, and I hope you continue coming to the Wings Over Houston, because there are a lot of people who need to meet you. So.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and all I can say is, good Lord willing, maybe we'll be back another year.
I hope so. Okay, well, this is Alan Wakim with the Sons of History with Colonel Charles McGee and his son Ronald. I want to thank you all, and I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you.